So this is how post-colonial is defined. So I took the definition from the reading I shared with you. Post-colonial literature is literature produced by writers from former colonies of imperial powers, usually European, in the languages of those powers, right? So in majority of the contemporary post-colonial states, uh, the language has been English, because the most recent empire that we are aware of is Britain, right? So uh, so the Britain has kind of ruled, uh, you know, immensely large uh, portion of the earth, and therefore they left their deep impact on the parts of the world that they ruled, including Africa and South Asia. Of course, uh, France had its own time, but then the most recent experience that we had was with England. So when for whatever reason, when the uh, imperial powers left certain, uh, colonized lands, they physically, in most of the cases, left the place, but then they, left a deep impact on that on the people of that particular uh, area or that particular, state. They became states later on. So that impact has been captured by the writers and the artists of those particular colonies. In most of the cases, the writers who wrote in the same language as was the language of the uh, empire, or as was the language of colonizer, only that literature is recognized to be post-colonial literature. In uh, in Pakistan, for example, lot many literature is being produced in many languages. So the literature in Urdu and other languages, regional languages, Sindhi, Punjabi, and all those languages. But all that literature is not always recognized as post-colonial literature. On the other hand, the literature which is being produced in English language, by writers like Mohsin Hamid, Hanif Qureshi, Babsi Sidhwa, that kind of literature is recognized as post-colonial literature. And the reason for that is this kind of literature that we call post-colonial literature, and which is often written in English language, it usually addresses the imperial powers. It either introduces those characters who move between uh, the native land, which is Pakistan, and the empire, which is Britain. Or this kind of literature introduces characters or introduces those themes which relate with two nations, right? So the nation of Pakistan and the nation of United Kingdom. In some cases, it could be some other imperial power as well, right? For example, the United States. So the literature which is written in native languages, like in Urdu or in Punjabi, it could be post-colonial as well, right? But preferably that literature is called regional literature with R, okay? Because it belongs to a particular region and belongs to a particular language and is written for a particular readership, right? So the Urdu literature usually is not meant to be read by the the former colonizers. But post-colonial literature is meant to be read by the former colonizers as well. In fact, the post-colonial literature gets more popularity in the former empires than in the native countries. That is why you will notice, if you get hold of books like the ones I just referred to, books by Hanif Qureshi or Mohsin Hamid or Babsi Sidwa, or writers of Kamla Shamsi, you will notice that their books are published by the publishers which are international. In most of the cases, either they are based in Britain or they are based in the United States. So the publishers who published that work, those are from the former colonizers, right? So my point is that post-colonial literature gets more popularity and more recognition in the West as compared to the native lands. And one obvious reason for that is that majority of the people in Pakistan do not speak English, right? Therefore, they would prefer to read literature which is written in regional local languages. And keeping the language English for post-colonial literature, that is a kind of requirement as well, because if the literature is not written in English, it most probably will not be read by and published by the Western, you know, uh, audience. And if it is not read by Western audience, then there is no point in writing this kind of literature. Well, there could be still some point in writing that kind of literature, but the main point is lost, which is to tell the colonizers how their ruling period in the native lands, how that ruling period has negatively impacted the native lands, right? So there is a lot more literature. I mean, I refer to just 3 authors from Pakistan, but then there are many authors from India as well, right? So let's move on to some of the uh, you know ideas about post-colonial literature. So the first thing is, what are the major countries which are post-colonial? So there are countries both in Asia and Africa, right? Um so it says such as India, which, which got independence uh, from United Kingdom in 1947, right? Uh, so you might see over here. I mean, I took these points from the readings I shared with you. Pakistan remains, a conspicuous absence from the reading itself. Okay, you won't find much of the mentioning of Pakistan as a post-colonial state, right? Uh, there are not many factors, but one important factor is that really Pakistani, academics or academia has not paid much attention to this kind of literature, right? So even if a few creative writers, just a few creative writers, even if they are producing that kind of work which is post-colonial uh, in its themes and in its style, yet there is not much debate about that work in Pakistan, right? So that is why Pakistan does not really uh, does not appear very significantly on the map of post-colonial literature. So Nigeria is another example, formerly ruled by an imperial power and then became a post-colonial country. Kenya is another one, and then Caribbean islands like Trinidad and Tobago, they also are counted as the post-colonial countries, right? So when you say Asia and Africa, of course, we are talking about many countries. Of course, Africa is there, and then the parts of the world in Korea, Southeast Asia, Japan, Vietnam, all those areas were also formerly colonized, right? So literature written uh, out of those countries could be post-colonial literature. So some of the major, writers and works. Well, there are not many more. Um, but a few which are really important, especially for us as well, for students in Pakistan. So Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart, 1958. Chinua Achebe was a Nigerian writer, right? So he wrote about the experiences of the local population after after colonization, right? And Things Fall Apart is a very interesting read. It's not a big novel, but in terms of its impact, it is a very big novel, right? So Chinua Achebe basically recreates the uh, tribal life of Nigeria in the novel, and he then captures the impact of colonial power on the local life, and he shows how the local life is destroyed by the intervention uh, you know uh, from the powerful white colonizers. Edward Said was not really creative writer. He did not write novels or short stories and plays, but he was a literary critic, right? He is also called a theorist, and he is one of the initial or pioneer theorists of what we call post-colonial theory. Okay, this word might be little new for you at this stage, but you will learn more about it later on. So I put him over here because when we talk about post-colonial literature, Edward Said is the most important name in propagating this concept about literature. And in his famous book Orientalism, he argued that the West had studied the East in a particular manner, and in such a manner that the West had always conceived the East to be inferior. Uh, he studies literature starting from Greeks until the contemporary times, and he shows to us how all the characteristics which are associated with the East, how all those characteristics are always derogatory in the Western literature. And his argument is that the reason for that is that the West has always considered uh, the Eastern nations or the Eastern people as racially inferior to the white race of the West. And then, based upon that, his argument was that there emerged in the West what we know as Orientalists, right? So, Orientalists are the researchers who study the Orient, right? And the Orient is the East. Okay, so the Orientalists, who were so-called experts of the Orient, experts of the East, they studied the East using their own tools of research, and then they wrote in detail about the East. So there were books of anthropology, there were books of history, there were books of related subjects which wrote observations about the East. But Edward Said points out that the whole structure of Orientalist knowledge, which is the knowledge about the East, as it was produced in the West, that whole structure was inherently racialized, because the West had, instead of actively exploring the reality of the East, had only analyzed it with reference to its own self. So the Western experts and researchers had treated the East to be, essentially inferior in the sense that the West had a preconceived notion of the East to be inferior. So they through the knowledge production about the East, they the West only justified or rationalized the preconceived opinion that they had about the East, right? So this becomes the foundation for what we call post-colonial theory, because then the experts and other writers from the former colonies, they started reading the works by the creative writers. They started reading them from this perspective, and they started noticing how the creative writers also represent exactly the same thing. That is, they represent that the countries in the East, they have their own uh, validity, and they have their own identity, and that identity could exist irrespective of the West, and the East did not need any validation from the West for its own identity. Rather, East could exist in its own right, with its own identity, with its own language system, with its own cultures, right? So then there were, there was that famous book Empire Writes Back by Bill Ashcroft, where he argued that how these former colonies or writers from there, they were actually responding to the empire when they produced this post-colonial literature. Anyways, Babsi Sidhwa is also a post-colonial writer. She is a creative writer, and I put her name over here. It's not in your reading, but because she is a writer from Pakistan, and I think we should be aware of at least the writers from Pakistan who are contributing to the post-colonial archive. So Babsi Sidhwa, of course, she was from Lahore, uh, sh- sh- and she has written not many works. But Cracking India is one of those works. She originally wrote in 1988, and she basically reflects on the experience of the partition for the people in India and Pakistan, right? And she projects a different view of the partition, not partition, not as a liberating experience, rather as an experience which was more violent for the people on both sides, right? So so that way she kind of questions the uh, common understanding that people had about partition as as a liberating experience for the people on the subcontinent. Okay, so this was about the post-colonial literature. If you have any questions, you can ask.